For those of you who don't know, my name is Johnny. I'm a coach at Dartmouth. I did my college debating at the University of Georgia, and I'm here to talk to you all about the elections DA. And my goal for this lecture is to enhance some of the vocabulary that you all have for discussing the elections DA in a nuanced way, in a way that reflects a lot of knowledge about what's going on with the election in a way that's a little bit smarter. There's a great deal of polarization in debate about going for elections or going for politics. Like, there are some people who are hardcore believers in the elections DA. There are some people who are, they're skeptics, they're non-believers. And this is true even amongst the staff. So, there are debaters such as myself who, went for politics all the time. There are other staffers like Turner, who detests the quality of link and internal link arguments on current politics disadvantages. And this dynamic might be true for some of you all. So my guess is selection bias has given me more elections believers than non-believers, but I'm sure there are some skeptics in the crowd too. And what I want to do with this lecture is kind of start to bridge that gap. So a common issue that I think many judges have with elections debates is this idea or meme that elections disads are overly generic, or they're kind of paint by numbers arguments that anyone can pick up. They can debate any AF without a whole lot of nuance. And I want to make these debates smarter and more detailed. So instead of winning the uniqueness debate by reading, 8 more uniqueness cards than the AF can, let's win uniqueness by discussing the differences between the polling methodologies that our cards use, or between polls and models, or between different modeling techniques, etc. The more nuance that we can have in our debates, the better we're going to look for our judges. So what is the elections disad? What do I mean by that? So the elections disadvantage is a disadvantage about the effects the plan might have on voting behavior. So, in the olden days, when someone might read elections disads multiple ways, the nomenclature for referring to an elections disad is always about which candidate the disad thinks will win now and is good. So given the state of uniqueness and impact literature, you'll probably only hear the Biden good elections disad this year, as that is the disad that was put out by our DDI generic group. That's the disad that's most likely to be run. The Trump good disad is just the reverse of all the parts that we will talk about, although I think it is unlikely that that's a disadvantage you'll hear a lot this year. So I want to kind of start with my top 5 reasons why I think you should read the elections disad, why I think it's a good disad, why I think it's a useful tool for the negative to have in their toolbox. So the primary reason that I think the elections disad is a really useful disad is it links to just about any affirmative. So politics debates tend to be, really popular early in the year and late in the year. So they're really popular when you're just starting the process of writing case negatives. You don't have specific link arguments for every AF, and they're really popular later in the year where new affirmatives become more popular and you debate more affirmatives that you don't have case negs to. So the elections disad, it's a good tool to have against AFs that might be smaller. Maybe they're crafted to get out of the more topic specific disads, even though there's not a ton of those on this topic. The second reason that I think the elections disad is super useful is it's typically external. So it almost always gets to an impact that's external, an impact that is easy to weigh against the affirmatives impact, and that's, I think, very useful for giving 2 and Rs. The third reason is the elections disad is the net benefit to a lot of common counterplans on this topic. So you'll probably hear the elections disad as a net benefit to courts, to states, maybe to executive non-enforcement. This topic, probably more than any high school topic in recent memory, is going to be really, really heavy on counterplan debates. And so I imagine it will be really heavy, at least in the fall, on the elections disad as the net benefit to these very common counterplans and kind of agent counterplans that solve the AF a lot. The fourth reason is it's easy to research. So I think that, the way to research the elections disad is something that's relatively easy to teach. There's, always a large depth of cards about every part of the disadvantage. It's easy to cut updates, even though some people tend to, rely on their camp file too far during the year. But, I think it is a very easy disad to pick up and learn and research. The fifth reason is I think that some of the turns the case arguments for the elections disad are relatively persuasive. So, what would a second term of Trump, do for example, problems like mass incarceration? And you can think about this the other way, which I think is really useful, which is, what sorts of problems might a new Democratic administration attempt to solve? Like, what would a Biden presidency do about, problems of criminal justice reform? Might they enact policies that are in line with the AF, et cetera? So the next thing I'm going to do is go through sort of part by part of the elections disad and talk about some of the concepts that I think are important in discussing those parts of the disad. And if this comes across more as like political science 1000, then how do I pick up an elections file 1000? That is all by design, because I want to talk about these concepts so we can discuss them in nuance when we're debating them, rather than this just be a, how do we pick up the file and execute it? Because I think that is the stuff that's a little bit easier and requires less explanation. So the uniqueness question of an elections disad is, obviously who will win the election now, which candidate is ahead. And this question, as a debate question, is almost always a question of what tools should we use to forecast who is ahead in the election now. So it's always that second level question of like, okay, we found a tool that says this candidate or that candidate is ahead. Why is that tool a good tool for forecasting an election? So the tool that most political scientists fall back on for forecasting is polling. And a poll is a public opinion survey where a sample of the US population is asked a question that's probably worded like, if the 2020 presidential election were held today, would you vote for Donald Trump, the Republican, or Joe Biden, the Democrat? An interesting technique that pollsters use is they will flip which candidate comes first in that question for every other respondent. So there's no bias for like which candidate they heard first or which candidate they heard last. The pollster will then weight their sample. So what do I mean by that? So a weight is a correction that the pollster makes to make their sample more representative of the population as a whole. Why is this important? Well, pollsters can know if they have underweighted a particular demographic group. So I can use data from the previous election to know that Hispanic voters represent around 9% of the electorate. So if in my poll, I only represented 3% Hispanic voters, I need to reweight my results to correct for that undersampling of Hispanic voters. So weighting is almost always about demographic groups. Sometimes it's about party registration. It is never about party identification. So party identification is within the poll, they will ask people, okay, which party do you feel like you most closely align with? Are you, a Republican, a Democrat? And then if someone says, well, I'm neither, I'm an independent, they'll say, okay, well, do you lean more with one party or the other party? And a common criticism you'll hear of polls is that, okay, they've undersampled Republicans by X amount, or they've undersampled Democrats by X amount. That's generally not true, because this party identification thing is, they're asking your attitude. They're not asking voting behavior. They're not asking which party you've registered with. They're asking a feeling, and feelings change. They're not stable things that we can weight polls with. Remember, with polling, we're trying to be as like scientific as possible, even though polling is by its nature a little bit imperfect. So, electoral polls have gotten a bit of a bad rap in the last 4 years for reasons that we'll talk about, but public opinion polling is a really common social scientific tactic that a lot of different organizations who are not talking about politics use to understand their audience. So, if I'm a television company and I'm trying to understand what the people who watch my television network view, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to survey or poll my viewers and ask them, which programming do you like to watch? What times do you like to watch television the most? Television companies do this all the time, and they make programming decisions based on these surveys. To tell you how important and useful polls are as a tool for forecasting elections, I think the best metric for this is every campaign has their own internal pollsters who conduct polls themselves, so they can tell their candidates, all right, here's where we are in the state of the race. Here's what issues maybe we're behind on. Here's what issues we need to talk about more. So campaigns think polling is important, and that's why these third-party viewers of elections and people who are trying to predict who's going to win elections also think that polling is pretty important. So uh, electoral polling in some sort of scientific sense began in 1936, which is when the Gallup poll, which is, a poll that still happens today, started. And, in those days, they didn't poll a ton of people. It was certainly a lot less scientific than polls are now. Like sample weighting was, something pretty foreign to them. There was kind of rampant non-response bias, even though there's a little bit of that now. And in the 1948 election, there was the first major polling error. So you've probably seen a really famous picture in politics of Harry Truman. He's, riding around his campaign victory party, and he's got a newspaper that says Dewey beats Truman. And this happened because the polling in 1948 showed Thomas Dewey, the Republican, beating Harry Truman by about 5 percentage points. And that was fairly consistent throughout the course of the election. And so newspapers who had to publish, their newspaper days ahead in order to get it out to the populace after the election, erroneously, printed papers saying that Thomas Dewey would win the election, even though Harry Truman ended up winning that election. Polling since then has been relatively accurate. It has, accurately predicted most elections, small exceptions here and there, 2000 being an example that a lot of polls were unable to get right, even though that election had its own quirks. Then 2016 happened. What happened in 2016? Well, as most of you who were probably, somewhat politically aware then, Hillary Clinton was leading Donald Trump in the polls fairly consistently throughout the course of 2016. Basically, the entire post-convention part of the election, Clinton was ahead in the aggregate polls, and Trump ended up winning. And a lot of people have pointed to this as a broad-scale indictment of the process of polling, or of the process of using polling as a method that people would use to forecast elections. So I think that there are a couple of, just kind of personal answers or objections I might have to this, well, 2016 means that polls never work argument. So my first objection is national polls were closely aligned with the way that the national popular vote ended up. So the Real Clear Politics polling average, which, Real Clear Politics, they're and a website about politics. They take polls and they average them, and they come out with this RCP average that you'll see referenced in a lot of the literature. Their average at the by the time the 2016 election happened was that Clinton would win by about 3%. Well, Clinton ended up winning the popular vote by about 2%. That's pretty close. That is, very comfortably within the margin of error. Where the 2016 polls got wrong was they were wrong in, a certain battleground states. So Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, these were the sort of big three states that voted for Obama in 2012 that ended up voting for Donald Trump in 2016. And a big problem with polling in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania is the pollsters didn't weight by education. So a very common question the pollsters will ask to get, demographic data is like, hey, who here has a 4-year college degree? And what we found in our analysis of the 2016 polls is these swing state pollsters in 2016 were not properly weighting the percentage of people in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania who did not have college degrees, who swung very, very hard for Donald Trump. And so, hopefully this weight by education problem is something pollsters have been able to fix in 2020. A couple other problems or arguments that people make regarding polling. So one argument is just there's rampant non-response bias. Non-response bias meaning the polling has undersampled the population because there are a bunch of people who don't answer polls. So for example, a lot of polls and a lot of polls that we might consider high quality polls conduct their polls by calling people. Now, I don't know about you, but for myself and for a lot of people I know, I do not pick up the phone for numbers that I don't recognize or numbers that are not in my contact list. So if Gallup or Monmouth or Quinnipiac or, pick your polling organization, if they called me and wanted to conduct a telephone poll, I would probably not pick up the phone. And that's true for a lot of people. And so pollsters miss a lot of the electorate, and they end up really only being able to interview like 10% of the people that they call. And so, that leads to potential non-response bias in polling. The other problem that some people have hypothesized about polling is this idea of the shy Trump voter. So there's this idea that supporters of Donald Trump, they don't want to tell other people that they support Donald Trump because they, see it as a like unpopular, political stance. They fear that people would like retaliate or think less of them because they support Donald Trump. And so there's a theory that, if someone who's a Trump voter gets called by a pollster and they're asked, who do you support? They're not going to say Trump because they're really shy about that effect. And nothing is new under the sun. This argument has been around for ages. It actually comes from an argument that conservatives in the UK made for a long time. They called it the shy Tory effect. Is this true? Maybe for some people, and maybe it's true anecdotally. I think I have a couple answers to this. One, we pick up a lot of Trump vote in polling. So, if this were true, I think we'd see a much larger effect throughout a bunch of polls in a bunch of states. The other thing is like, when I interact with Trump voters or, when I see Trump voters, they don't come across as particularly shy. Like, his voters tend to be very enthusiastic. They tend to support him enthusiastically. So I'm skeptical over whether Trump voters are shy in the context of polling. So what's the state of polling now? Have we fixed the problems of 2016? Well, the polls in the 2018 midterms, they were pretty good. Maybe we fixed this weight by education problem, and maybe we've dealt with some of the problems of polling. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we're talking about polling in the context of debate, you usually don't want to talk about one poll. So if you've got a card that's like the most recent Quinnipiac poll had Joe Biden up by 15 points, you don't really have a very persuasive card because you just have one poll. There's a lot of noise when we're talking about one poll, right? Single polls, they talk to about 1,200 people. Single polls really do have small sample sizes. So what you want to talk about is aggregate polling, or you want to use companies that take polls, average them together, and then come up with a number. So that Real Clear Politics number is useful. 538 and Nate Silver, that is a very useful website. So what Silver does is he rates pollsters. So, if you use good polling methods, like you accurately weight your samples, you use a mix of telephone and online, text and call, then you're going to get a good grade. And he rates you by grade. So he'll give polls, A plus. If you've got really good methods, you get like a D. If you have really bad methods, if you get an F, he's just not going to use you. And then he corrects for house effects. So if you have a poll that's like fairly consistently, so for example, Rasmussen fairly consistently has a Trump house effect, of about like, between 1 and 2%, like about 1.5%. Silver will correct for that house effect in his average. Models. So modeling, started, in the 2000s, and models use national, state polls. Sometimes they use other factors to determine which candidate is more or less likely to win the election. So there are sort of three types of models that you'll see. Poll-only models, so like the New York Times Upshot model, they'll use polls, they'll paste them onto states and try to tell you who is most likely to win the Electoral College with polling. The second type of model that you'll hear is fundamental models. So fundamentals models say, look, polling, it's bad. Who wins the election is really about these kind of external factors. It's not about asking people, but we can tell by using things like the state of the economy or some political factor to figure out who's going to win. The one that is really popular to talk about is this thing called the Keyes model. And the Keyes model was this professor named Alan Lichtman. He has this model where, if you turn 6 keys, and these keys are like, how is the economy doing good or bad? Is there a foreign policy crisis? Is the candidate charismatic? If you turn X number of keys, then the incumbent will win the election or the challenger will win the election. The Keyes model is relevant because Lichtman was one of the only people to predict a Trump victory in 2016. And so that's why people talk about the Lichtman model a lot. He's been right in a lot of elections. The other model that you might hear about is this thing called the primary model. The primary model is relevant because this guy, Helmut Norpoth, he is the only person that I have found who is actively predicting a Trump victory in 2020. And Norpoth's theory is that the election, it's not about polls, it's not about the economy, it's about who had the easiest time in their primary. And so his theory is, Trump, he was relatively unchallenged in the primary, there was no major challenge to his status. So, he breezed through the primary. Biden had a contested primary. He had to beat back, folks like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. So, he had a harder primary, so he's going to lose. That's the primary model. Other models, they use polls and they use some fundamentals. So the 538 model, which hasn't come out yet, Silver uses a combination of polls as well as some underlying models like how's the economy doing to predict. A common argument that you'll hear affirmative teams forward, and an argument you should forward if you're affirmative against the elections dissad, is like, it's just too early to tell. I cannot tell you who's going to win in November by measuring the electorate in July. And, this is maybe true. I think there are some historical reasons why this might not be true. So, for a long time, leads in July have held. The AF needs an extra argument to win this. So they need not just it's too early to tell, but they need something's going to happen between now and November that's going to change the election. The other thing that I kind of want to talk about in terms of discussing uniqueness is this idea of the Trump Electoral College advantage. So this is the idea that, look, the swing states, they're probably going to be some percentage point to the right than the national polls. So, we've already seen Clinton won the popular vote by about 2%, lost the election. It's possible that Joe Biden could win the popular vote by like 3 or 4 percentage points and still lose the Electoral College because of this innate advantage that Trump has with, working class folks in these tipping point states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Link arguments. So a link argument for an elections dissad is almost always about how the plan makes the incumbent or the incumbent party look. So incumbency refers to the current holder of the office. So Trump, as the sitting president, is the incumbent, and all the link arguments that we'll make will focus on how the plan bolsters his electoral prospects. So when I was reading the 2016 elections dissad, Hillary Clinton was not the sitting president. She was not technically an incumbent, but all the link arguments were about her because she was really, her and her electoral college perceptions were very much tied to Obama and the Obama administration. She was the Secretary of State. She was tied to stuff that that administration did. So when you're making link arguments for an elections DA, you're almost always talking about the incumbent. And in this case, you're arguing that the plan helps Trump win the election. Now, I don't think this means you read 70 cards on the block that the plan is a net popular action. I think that that is the not smart way to read the elections DA. I think you want to say that the plan changes the minds of certain demographic groups who are important for the election. So, this is critically important. You want both that the plan changes the minds of voters in certain demographic groups and that those demographic groups are going to shape the election. They're important in swing states or they're broadly important. So I'll talk about 3 demographic groups that I think are relevant for criminal justice reform. So first, millennials. Millennial voters, they are tend to be broadly liberal, especially on social issues. So they really like criminal justice reform. They really think there's a problem in criminal justice. And so they like criminal justice reform. They probably also, might find things like decriminalizing marijuana to be relatively important. The issue with link arguments about millennials or about youth voters is millennial turnout is relatively low. Old people vote, young people, not so much. However, this might be changing. So millennial turnout, it increased in 2016. It was around 46% in 2012. It was around 50% in 2016. So there could be arguments about why millennials are being more engaged, why they might be like really important voters for Biden. You need those cards that say they're important for the broader electorate. The second group who might matter for criminal justice reform is Black voters. So part of the story of 2016 was the decrease of Black turnout. So, Black turnout was very high in 2008 and 2012 for Obama. It was pretty low in 2016. And one of the theories for why it was really low is the Trump campaign did a really good job of kind of exploiting Hillary Clinton's problematic past with criminal justice reform, with calling, certain Black folks super predators. Like that comment was played and was part of a kind of broader advertisement campaign that the Trump campaign had against Clinton. And he's going to try to do the same thing with Joe Biden, who also has some historic issues, comments like the "You Ain't Black" comment from a couple months ago. The plan might help show Black voters that Trump is, he takes criminal justice reform seriously, and he can use that as a wedge issue for Black voters who historically, they swing very Democratic. They're, a lot of times we'll hear that Black voters are the base of the Democratic Party, and the reason being is, Black voters tend to vote Democratic by about a, 90% to 10% difference. This held true in 2016. It was a little more. It was like 91%, 6%, but that 90 to 10, that's true in a lot of elections. The other group that matters a lot is suburban voters, and particularly suburban women. So the story that's been told, for folks who have taken a lot of, who have looked closely at 2020 polls, you'll see that Biden is polling a lot better than Clinton. So he's currently leading in the RCP average by about 8.5%, so 8 to 9%, that's a number you see a lot. And the difference between Biden's support today and Clinton's support in 2016, a lot has to do with his support amongst educated folks in suburban areas. You'll see that a lot of people are describing a tipping point in the 2020 election as the Floyd protests and the broader national conversation that we've begun to have about criminal justice reform. So suburban voters, they care a lot about issues of race. They care about issues of criminal justice reform. They're upset that Trump doesn't take these issues seriously. They trust Joe Biden more on these issues, and that's why they're swinging hard for Biden. So an argument could be made that Trump, by doing the plan, shows he's serious about CJR, shows he's going to play to those voters' interests. And so, there's an argument to be made that new criminal justice reform policies could help Trump with these crucially important suburban voters who, as of today, might be the difference between a Biden win and what was a Democratic loss with Hillary Clinton in 2016. The other groups of voters that you'll see discussed in the electorate are, voters who switched parties. So you'll hear these Romney-Clinton voters is a really common phrase that you'll see in the political science literature. And typically, these Romney-Clinton voters are referring to some of these suburban voters who, they might have issues with Trump's temperament, but they might be sort of nominally conservative, so could still be persuaded to vote for him. The other folks that you'll see talked about is the Obama-Trump voters. These are typically the folks who we describe as like white working class, the sort of factory, the boaters and bikers, those folks. So the voters who changed their mind, who are the Trump Biden voters or the Clinton Trump voters, right? Those are the people that are going to shape this 2020 election, and those are the people you want to talk about. So I think that my broad point with all of this is when you're discussing link arguments, they are incomplete without internal link arguments. So I would rather hear a story that's like suburban voters matter in swing states more than I would want to hear 70 cards about why the plan is net popular for Trump. So common AF arguments with regards to this internal link stuff. I think the best argument that the AF has is that other issues matter more than criminal justice reform. So the coronavirus matters more. Voters care more about economic policy. Maybe they care more about things like healthcare. They care more about, temperament. That argument is a really powerful one that the affirmative has. And the only way that the negative can beat back against that argument is with these internal link arguments, is with our examples of demographic groups that we think are particularly important. So I think the only way we beat back against other issues matter more is we're like, look, other issues might matter more for the broader populace, but they've already had their minds made up. The people that matter, the undecideds, they're the suburban voters, and they care about criminal justice reform the most. That story, that packaging, I think is going to be really persuasive for you in executing this disadvantage. The other argument that I think people are going to make is just people have made their minds up about Trump. So Trump has been president for 4 years. He is obviously one of the most polarizing figures of our time. People hate him. Some people love him, but people, they largely think what they think about him today. And there's, this I think is where some people who are making the uniqueness overwhelms the link argument. That's the argument they're making. So Joe Biden's going to win regardless of what happens because people have made their minds up about Trump. They've made their minds up about his temperament, and they're not going to have their minds changed either way. My personal objection to that argument is like, look, polling has changed. We've seen changes in Trump's approval rating recently. We've seen polls fluctuate. We wouldn't see that if people just, full stop, had their minds made up about Trump. Clearly, there are people that can change their minds. There are still some undecided voters. Things can happen. Impact arguments. So it is important for your Trump bad impact argument to be specific to the second term. I don't want to see impact arguments that are like, there's a possibility that Trump could do this bad foreign policy thing. That's going to lose to a cross-ex question of why hasn't this happened yet? You need cards about the second term. There are some very good articles about how in the second term, Trump will feel like he's not checked. And so he's going to do, crazy, outlandish foreign policy stuff. You'll also see a lot of arguments about our participation in things like the Paris Agreement. That's going to be set based on who's president in 2020. There's like a possibility that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, could be revived if we had a new Democratic administration. So all of that stuff is specific to the second term. The other thing that you'll see is, Biden Democrats solve the case. So maybe a Joe Biden administration might decriminalize marijuana, or they might have restrictions on the death penalty. They might do the thing that the AF says. And this is a really powerful tool. It's just one card. Biden solves the AF. That's a really powerful tool that the negative has when they're executing the politics disad. So search terms. When you are researching uniqueness, you know, common search terms include Biden, Trump, win now, ahead, polling, models. You want to search for Real Clear Politics, 538, Nate Cohn, Harry Inton, Alan Lichtman. A lot of the really good uniqueness cards you're going to cut might not come primary source from those folks, but they're going to come from folks who are quoting those people. So they'll say, look, we've looked at the Real Clear Politics average and we've looked at the 538 polling average, and we see consistently 8.5 percentage point lead for Joe Biden, and that's how we've come to the conclusion that Biden is ahead. So some of the best cards you'll find are not primary source from these people I've talked about, but they're from people quoting that. When you're researching link arguments, wedge issue, criminal justice reform, bolt from the blue, triangulation, pivot, all of these, arguments are things that you might see from cards that talk about how important criminal justice reform could be as like an issue that Trump could take advantage of, use as a wedge issue to, kind of bring his campaign back, late in the day. And you might find some of these cards would be like, all right, Trump's behind now. Here are the things he could do to win the election. One of those might be criminal justice reform. Those are going to be your really powerful link cards. Impacts, second term, foreign policy. If you're looking for the warming stuff, the Paris Agreement, stuff about Joe Biden, all of that stuff is really useful. Extending the elections DA. Once again, there's this kind of common refrain that you'll hear in coaching, which is like, the politics disad must be and should always be in the 1 and R because you don't want to get cross-sexed on it. I think that's like totally bogus. I am happy if you want to put the elections disad in the 2 and C. If you're a 2N, you're happy extending elections, the elections DA makes you happy, keep it in the 2 and C, by all means. Now, sometimes, the 1 and R, they've got more time to prep, they can pull all the cards, they can go through and indict each piece of 2AC evidence. Sometimes you might want to put it in the 1 and R for that reason. I don't think you should have, I'm scared of being cross-sexed on this as my reason for putting it in the 1 and R. If you're scared of being cross-sexed on the elections DA, you should be scared of giving a 2 and R on the elections DA, and it shouldn't be in the block. So it is important in the elections DA to always, double up, read twice as many cards as the affirmative has read on whatever issue that they're proposed, whatever carded argument that they have. So if they're reading a, Trump wins now card, you want to read 2 Biden wins now cards in response, and so on and so forth. You really want to make sure that you're overwhelming the other team with cards, because that makes it a lot easier to give that time press 2 and R, because you can refer to like, hey, we are outcarding them on this issue, 2 to 1, our cards are way better. You also want to start the process of evidence comparison in the block. So going through 2AC cards, talking about why they're bad, why, they only use single polls, or those single polls are bad, or they're using faulty fundamentals models and not fundamental plus polls models. So go through and start that evidence comparison. It makes the 2 and R so much easier if the 2 and C or the 1 and R has already set the stage for doing the evidence comparison that the 2 and R needs to do on these different issues about the election. The 2 and R, I think a lot of time commitment on the elections DA depends on, are you extending a counterplan or are you not extending a counterplan? If you are extending a counterplan and that counterplan is meant to solve the case, you don't need to spend a ton of time on the elections DA. You just need to win a risk of it, and you need to win that your counterplan solves the ath. If you don't have that counterplan involved, you need to spend a lot of time winning the elections DA, because that's the place you're going to win the debate on. You're probably going to go hard on these turns case or solves the case arguments. 2 and R time allocation with the elections DA, I think it is very contingent on, do you have a counterplan or do you not have a counterplan? Answering the elections DA. So, uniqueness arguments, a combination of Trump wins now. These are going to be hard to find. but you're mostly going to find them in these fundamental models, stuff like the primary model. That's where you're going to find those cards. Too early to tell cards are very good. So this is where you might find these historic criticisms of polling. You'll find a lot of people who say stuff like, polling in July tells us absolutely nothing about the way polls will behave or about the way voters will behave in November. And you might also find kind of broad critiques of national polling. So they'll say national polls, they don't matter. We know the Electoral College is how we decide presidents. It doesn't matter about how much the gap in the national popular vote is. It's all about the Electoral College. So like swing state polling, that's where it's at. Black swan events. So, random stuff could happen in October that could totally make people forget the plan. So, think about it. Like Trump decriminalizes marijuana on the federal level today, July 21st. And then October 30th, he announces that he has approved vaccine for the coronavirus and says we've solved the coronavirus with Operation Warp Speed. Well, what are people going to remember when they go to the ballot box? Are they going to remember the vaccine that was approved a week ago for the pandemic that has like totally wrecked the country for months on end? Or are they going to remember the criminal justice reform policy in July? Probably the thing that happened in October, right? So some of these black swan events, like stuff's going to happen in October, those arguments are really useful. The base link turn. So the basic argument that Trump's base, his voters, they like law and order, right? Trump is running on a law and order campaign on kind of restoring this idea, this kind of classic Nixonian ideal that, we should have law and order. It's kind of an anti-criminal justice reform policy. So there's a possibility that people in the base might think that the plan makes Trump look weak. It looks like he's, appeasing Antifa or, whatever. So the base link turn, I think that's fairly popular, going to be fairly popular. The way that the neg wants to answer the base link turn is they want to say, look, the base is locked in. They periodically get mad at things that might not fit in with their preconceived notion of ideology, but that doesn't matter because they're a cult of personality. They're going to vote for Trump no matter what because, he speaks their language. He's not politically correct or whatever. Base voters, they're not swing voters. They're not like suburban women. They don't change their mind about candidates. And so that's the way I think the neg's going to handle that argument. Thumpers. So stuff like the First Step Act. So Trump has done criminal justice reform in the past. He's come out in support of this Tim Scott bill that would like create a national registry for for instances of police brutality. So Trump has signaled in the past that he's open to doing some instances of criminal justice reform. Maybe that thumps some of these link arguments. Other stuff matters more. We've talked about that a little bit. Impact arguments. So Trump, not that bad, or there will continue to be constraints. So the constitutional process, the court, advisors, what have you, they might be able to check a second term of Trump. Even if Trump wins a second term, the House probably stays Democratic. Maybe the Senate flips Democratic. So that's an additional constraint on, whether Trump can do these like crazy foreign policy things. Or, you could read, Biden bad arguments, like Biden might be bad for certain foreign policy issues. He might be overly interventionist in areas where Trump, might not be. Trump has, talked a lot about ending wars, not being involved in a lot of foreign policy stuff. So maybe Biden is bad in terms of his hawkishness. So I had a debater in my lab ask me, is it like strategic to say Trump good in the 2AC or Trump good as a response to the elections DA? And I was a little flippant to this debater. I was like, I don't think that's a very strategic argument because I don't think the cards are as good as the Trump bad cards. I want to, potentially check that a little bit. Like there are, Biden bad being a similar argument, that's a potential strategic layer that the AF could go to. I do certainly believe that Trump bad cards better than Trump good cards. And my response to this that I wish I would have emphasized in that moment was I think arguments about uniqueness and link are a lot better than arguments about impact. I think that a strategy around Trump good or Biden bad is just like the path of more resistance when you're extending the elections disad than the path of, we cannot predict the election in August or July, and the plan would fracture Trump's base, and the millennials and suburban voters have already made up their minds about Trump's temperament. Like, those arguments are just way more persuasive than these impact arguments. So I have talked mostly about the presidential elections disad. This camp also put out a Senate elections or a down ballot elections disad. It's very similar. It's the Democrats are going to win the Senate now. The plan flips that. There's an impact related to why it would be good if Democrats controlled the Senate. I think that, the reason why I haven't talked a ton about this disad is I think it's just conceptually basically the same as this presidential elections disad. I think it has an additional weakness, which is the question of why do important GOP senators have to vote for the bill? So, for example, one of the senators involved in the link cards for this DA is Georgia, David Perdue, and Kelly Loeffler. Well, I have a kind of, being from Georgia, I don't think either David Perdue or Kelly Loeffler are going to vote for criminal justice reform, given the million ads I've seen about law and order in the past week and a half. So I think there's a question about why do these GOP senators who swing the election, who swing the aggregate Senate map, why do they have to vote for the bill? So now I'm going to stop the recording and we will start our Q&A session